Hello, my name is Alex Hsu, and I'm representing the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm here in Notre Dame, Indiana, and I'm joined today by Nikhil Mandalaparthy, the Advocacy Director for Hindus for Human Rights. He's formerly of the Aspen Institute's Inclusive America Project, a graduate of University of Chicago with an AM in International Development, an AB in Public Policy, and he self-identifies as and I'm taking this from the website, your website, a writer, organizer, and arts curator who is passionate about the history, religion, and arts of South Asia and the South Asian diaspora. Welcome, Nikhil.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. I'm realizing now that that description, covers quite a wide range of topics and interests. But yeah, really excited to be here and chat with you.
Likewise. So I want to start by having you tell our audience a little bit about the organization that you're newly representing. So congratulations on the new job, Hindus for Human Rights. What is it all about? When did it start? Where are you located? What are you up to?
Yeah, great question. So Hindus for Human Rights is a nonprofit advocacy organization. It was started in 2019, so it was the summer right after Narendra Modi was re-elected in India, the current prime minister. And the goal of Hindus for Human Rights is really to advocate on issues of pluralism, civil rights, and human rights in South Asia and in North America from kind of a Hindu perspective, and to provide a Hindu voice of resistance to caste, to Hindutva, which is Hindu nationalism, to racism, and just all forms of bigotry and oppression. And so we are a nonprofit advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. So a lot of our advocacy is, with the U.S. government on Capitol Hill, as well as, the administration, State Department, and other offices, members of Congress, and also working with a lot of partners who represent, Muslims, Christians, Dalits, different minorities who are impacted by the violence and oppression that's taking place in India right now. And so we work with a lot of coalitions and in these kind of partnerships to, again, add a Hindu voice to advocacy that's saying, we need to stand up for pluralism and equality and justice, given what's happening right now in the name of Hinduism or Hindu identities. So I would say like our advocacy right now is really to the US government, but we do have members and chapters kind of across the Indian Hindu diaspora. So we have a chapter in Australia, we have members in India, as well as many other countries. And so we are based in the US, but trying to build this kind of global Hindu progressive movement.
So you mentioned that you're fighting against oppression, domination in all its forms, especially in India, but also everywhere there are Indians. What are the forms of oppression and domination that you're contesting? And then are those forms of oppression and contestation, oppression and domination, also inspired by something called Hinduism?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say like Hindus for Human Rights really came out of the very specific context of where Indian politics is right now, and what a lot of progressive-minded people in the diaspora were seeing and wanting to make a difference. So the impetus for forming this organization was really to combat what we call Hindutva, which is Hindu nationalism, and that is a very modern 100-year-old political ideology that's taken root in India, as well as in the diaspora as well. And it's this ethno-nationalist right-wing ideology that argues that India should be a country for Hindus, and only Hindus are true Indians. And this is in a country where a fifth of the population is not Hindu. And so advocates for Hindutva argue that Muslims specifically, but also Christians and other minorities, should live as second-class citizens, and only if they accept the supremacy of the Hindu majority can they be allowed to live in India. And so for many decades, this was seen as a more of a fringe ideology, I guess you could say. Of course, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist, and this ideology has been around since the 1920s. But it's really with the election of Narendra Modi in 2014 that the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party, has had kind of full reign to go all out and implement kind of a Hindu nationalist agenda in India. And so we've been seeing violence against minorities, Christians, Muslims, Dalits, many other kind of worrying signs of shrinking democracy, and freedom of speech and the media has all been kind of attacked. But all of this is being done through the language of Hindu identity, and in the vision of creating a Hindu Rashtra, or a Hindu nation. And so there have been a lot of groups that have been working on these issues for decades and for several years, providing kind of a human rights perspective or civil rights perspective, and saying that this is wrong because we are, seeing these shrinking rights. And of course, representatives of different minorities have also been advocating for their own protection and rights in a secular democracy like India. And so there have been Muslim groups, Christian groups, Dalit groups doing this advocacy against Hindutva. But there really has not been a solid, widespread movement of Hindu people of Hindu background, Hindu faith, who are seeing what's happening in India and saying, as a Hindu, I want to raise my voice and oppose this in the name of my identity. And there have been some efforts, but not really in a systematic kind of organizational movement. And so that's what we've been trying to build at Hindus for Human Rights, is this platform for people to say, I am Hindu and I oppose Hindutva, and it's kind of this not in my name mentality that we are adding to all of these other movements, which of course are centering Muslims, Dalits, and Christians. We're here to provide that ally perspective, as we are also part of the majority and we want to stand up against this. So that's sort of the crux of it right now, is combating Hindutva. But of course, we are very actively working to tackle issues of caste, racism, xenophobia here in the US, where Hindus are a minority, and many of these other isms that we're all kind of aware of and working on. And I just want to also touch on the caste question as well, because I think what we've been seeing since 2014 is a response by some liberal Hindus to say that Modi's Hinduism or the BJP's Hinduism is not my Hinduism. This is a perversion of my faith. My faith does not teach me to be violent, to kill people, etc. But there's almost this tendency to say, like, Hinduism was fine before Modi came on the scene, or before Hindutva, and we're very conscious that that kind of rhetoric of saying like things were fine before Hindutva is also not necessarily true, because for people from oppressed castes, for Dalits particularly, Hinduism has always been a kind of force of oppression, or denying people certain dignities and equality. And so we're very cognizant of not trying to fall into that trap, and instead saying, we come from this community, we have a connection to this faith, or really a collection of faiths is what Hinduism is. And we want to draw on the best parts of that and work to discard and really reject the worst parts of it. And it's also about creating a new way of being Hindu and centering these values of equality and justice in the way that we live out our faith in the world.
I want to return to describing some of the more outrageous violations of human rights, and or that your organization sees as violations of human rights in India in a little bit. But I think I want to focus on the positive side of Hindus for Human Rights, where you're gaining a lot of your brain trusts and intellectual energies and spiritual energies from. And have you speak a little bit about your faith journey to Hindus for Human Rights, and what it is you take Hinduism to be, what it gives for you, how you would define it for our viewers, many of whom might be Hindu in different ways, but many of whom are probably not and might not even know the first thing about Hinduism.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. My own journey with Hinduism, I guess I can start on that and sort of get into how we at Hindus for Human Rights kind of draw on our own backgrounds and traditions. So I grew up in the US, in Seattle, Washington. And my family is from South India. They're from Andhra Pradesh specifically. And so I grew up in a fairly religious, upper caste Hindu family, living in the suburbs of Washington, where there was a pretty sizable Indian community. Sort of a lot of it was the post 1965 kind of tech boom, immigration. So my relatives were working at Microsoft and Amazon and all these kind of tech companies. So there's a very vibrant Indian community in the Seattle area, and so we would go to temples on festival days, and my family follows a particular guru, and so we would go to those bhajans, which is sort of devotional singing, and Sunday classes and all of that stuff. I was sort of immersed in being Hindu and being Indian, and there was a lot of kind of community events and programming happening. At the same time, I was also usually the only Indian in my classes, Indian student from elementary school through high school. It just so happened that like the one suburb of Seattle where we were living didn't actually have that many Indians. And so I was usually the only Indian student or the only Hindu student in my classes growing up. And that, of course, meant that when we got to the ancient India section of, social studies or talking about, world religions, that I like had to assume this position of spokesperson for all of India and all of the Hindus. And, that was like, I remember, I think the first time for example, like the first time I learned about caste, I think it was in my 6th grade social studies curriculum, where we had this, the pyramid, and you see Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudra, the different categories, and that was never something that was implicitly, discussed at home, or it was never explicitly discussed. And that comes from the privilege of being an upper caste person and in not having to think about your caste in ways that oppressed caste people have to think about. But I'd say the way in which Hinduism was taught was very much as this like exotic, superstitious kind of, those people, pray to cows and have this oppressive caste system. And that was sort of what I was trying to push back at. I remember even as a 6th grader being like, well, this might all be true, but like, there's also ways in which people still find meaning in this, and it's still like it's not like a, there is something there that draws people even today, and it's not kind of this exotic phenomenon to just gawk at. And so I was always interested, I'd say, in religion and spirituality and all of that. I remember that like all of these epics, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, like all the heroes were like my first superheroes. I didn't really watch that many Marvel movies or things like that, but like those kind of stories were what I, enjoyed reading and learning about. And so Hinduism was always this like source of strength, I'd say, and kind of inspiration. And it was something that differentiated me from others. I could say that I'm Hindu and I'm Indian, and this is what makes me unique. Um, and it wasn't until high school that I started learning more about other faith traditions also. I kind of expanded beyond Hinduism and started learning a lot about Islam in particular, just reading a lot, like teaching myself Arabic and Urdu and Persian, and just like really immersing myself in another faith tradition. And I just started learning more about, you know, Indian politics and the broader region. And all that is to say that like I had this interest in religion and Hinduism, but it wasn't really politicized until 2014, which was my senior year of high school, and that's when Modi was elected as prime minister in India. And so Modi's election was my first introduction to Hindu nationalism. I remember the Indian election was happening, and my parents would be talking about it, you know, at the dinner table, and I just remember being so like, there's just so many acronyms, and it's just a whole different kind of world compared to to U.S. politics. So I took this as like a challenge. I was like, okay, let me try and figure out what's going on in Indian politics. And I was so horrified that this is the scene that this right wing Hindu nationalist BJP party was seen to be the forerunner and was projected to win. And this person, Narendra Modi, has such a um, dark history of overseeing massacres of Muslims and these religious riots. And this was the person that was going to become the prime minister. And that was the first time I really came across this way that Hindu identity was weaponized and used as a violent force and for political gain. And then so Modi's election happened. I started learning a lot about Hindutva. I went to college. The following year was the 2016 election when Trump was, campaigning, and I was seeing, even in the U.S., that this rise of Hindus for Trump and these really like right-wing conservative Indian uncles were all kind of mobilizing out of this shared Islamophobia that they had and Trump had, and really trying to build up this support for Trump in the Indian Hindu community. And both of those, I think, elections really like opened my eyes to the way that Hindu identity has been, just in the last few years, really, really radicalized and weaponized for this kind of political purposes. And at the same time, I was starting to learn about caste and my own kind of blindness growing up to kind of the inequities and the horror that is the caste system. And all of this kind of culminated in like an existential crisis in my freshman year of college, where I was like, can I even be a good person and call myself Hindu if this is what Hindu groups and Hindu individuals are doing in the world, this sort of violence and right-wing bigotry, like what does it mean for myself to still have this attachment to Hinduism? And I just started looking for so many resources online. I would just Google every combination of Hinduism, social justice, progressive Hinduism, and I came across this group called Sadhana. It's an organization called Sadhana Coalition of Progressive Hindus, and they're based in New York City. I wrote to them as like a freshman in college. I was like, this is exactly what I've been looking for, people who have been tackling these issues and talking about them within, the Hindu community. And I started volunteering for them, and I joined the board of Sadhana a couple of years later, and I'm still on the board of Sadhana right now. And so the work of Sadhana is really to provide a platform and community for progressive Hindus, people who are grappling with social justice questions and also what it means to be Hindu. And the co-founder of Sadhana is also the co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. And what we were running into in Sadhana was as this violence in India is increasing and there's more and more blatant, this rise of Hindu nationalism was really quite alarming. And just in the last few years, we realized we needed not just a community building space, which is what sadhana really is. It's a place for discussions and kind of reinterpreting texts and practices. But this political advocacy work began to seem more and more urgent. And so Hindus for Human Rights was formed sort of on the shoulders of sadhana, but specifically for the purposes of combating Hindu nationalism and all of these kind of forces in India through political advocacy, which is where we got to today, and my current position as advocacy director with HFHI.
Thanks. How does things that we typically associate with religious practice or spiritual practice,
Yeah.
whether that's contemplation or prayer or scriptural study, or communion with others, eating meals together, murti worship, or how do these sort of aspects of religious devotion and practice tie up to political practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that definitely our advocacy as an organization is we always try to root it in the values that we see that are at the heart of our faith and traditions. So shanti or peace, nyaya is justice, satya as truth. These are of course secular concepts, but these are also concepts which are very important in Hindu philosophy and teachings. And I would say like the meaning of sadhana, this previous organization which I talked about, is also used as a term for just generic spiritual practice. You'd say doing meditation in the morning is my sadhana, or doing puja, to a deity is my kind of sadhana. And the way that we interpret it is as faith in action. So our sadhana is, of course, personal devotion and contemplation, but it's also going to a protest and speaking out as a Hindu, and it's also confronting your own community when really problematic dynamics are in play and no one else seems to be speaking up. That's also our putting our faith into action. So I think what we've been trying to do is really like reinterpret these key concepts which we always talk about, dharma and satya and shanti, and open them up to interpretation as inspiration for political action, if that makes sense. One example is the concept of dharma is of course very prevalent in Hinduism and Buddhism and other dharmic kind of traditions. And dharma, of course, has many different meanings. It can be used to just be like your duty as an individual. So I have a dharma as a son or as a brother, this family relations. I, had a dharma as a student. Now I have a dharma as advocacy director. It's, duty in that way. But also dharma has been used to say your caste occupation. And so to do your dharma means to not deviate from like your position in the caste hierarchy and to do what your father did and not break out of that occupation, which is a very oppressive way of thinking about it. But dharma is also speaking out for justice and inequality. And in so many of our statements and public advocacy, we try to consistently say that our dharma as Hindus right now is to fight Hindutva and to not let these like right-wing supremacist groups be the only spokesperson for our faith. And so that's like one way in which I'd say that we draw on many of these concepts and that are part of Hindu traditions and practice and try to infuse them with like a new interpretation that's orienting them kind of to look to the world, not to turn away from the world. And that's one way in which I kind of give that example. And I'd say that there are, of course, many different people in this for human rights who come from different traditions within kind of the umbrella of Hinduism. And so we have people who are very, for whom murti puja and image worship is extremely important. We have people who have kind of rejected those parts of the practice, but see, textual study as really important, and engaging with the Upanishads and the Vedas. And personally, for me, I find a lot of inspiration in bhakti poetry and kind of the vernacular language songs and arts that came out of the so-called bhakti movements, which are often very radical in certain ways and questioning, hierarchies. And for me, that's something which I've tried to bring into, my advocacy, is that sort of bhakti movement kind of lens. And we all put it out into our advocacy in different ways. If it's a statement at a protest, or even a letter that's open letter, or in online social media posts. I think we all have kind of different ways of engaging with the traditions and different types of practice, but it's a really exciting and creative kind of work, I think. I think the common theme for all of us is that we feel that there is something there still that's tying us to this larger tradition. And it would be really easy for me to, in theory, to just drop all of this Hindu stuff and just do human rights advocacy as, in a completely secular way of just talking about, civil rights and the values that we all kind of hold dear, but not to keep all this religious stuff out of it. But I think there's something which I think is really powerful and useful and meaningful to be able to ground your activism in kind of a larger tradition, and to say that, there is a way of engaging with the world and drawing on Hinduism, and the only way of expressing your Hindu identity in the public sphere doesn't have to be this right-wing, violent, aggressive Hindutva. It can also be this inclusive and egalitarian interpretations of the faith.
One connection, our conversation is leading me to reflect upon how we here at the University of Notre Dame have been talking about various Catholic communities, some of us who are members of Catholic communities, some of us who have Catholic members in our families, but these sort of intra-faith conversations that we have across the political aisle, right? Many Catholics went for Trump. Many Catholics went for Biden, who is also Catholic. I think this is a really familiar dynamic. And so when you mentioned Modi's election in 2014, I think for many of our viewers, especially our young viewers, they're probably also thinking, oh yeah, this was also what we experienced at Christmas, right? With all my relatives. What sort of resources does Hindu for Human Rights have, or does Sadhana have for, progressive Hindus who might feel sort of in a minoritarian position with respect to either their parents or their elders or where they're worshiping?
Yeah, it's really tough. And to give you a sense of like what the landscape is like, I feel like most Hindu temples in this country are in some way or another, they may have some sort of affiliation with what is called the Sangh Parivar, or the family of Hindu nationalist organizations that of course originated in India but have come to the diaspora. And it's really difficult because many of these organizations started in the 70s and the 80s, or as larger and larger populations of Hindus were migrating to the US, and they really capitalized on this opportunity to position themselves as the Hindu organizations of America. So if you go to any temple, they're probably connected with an organization like, the HSS or VHPA. And of course, there are many temples which may not be connected, but many of these organizations, Hindu nationalist organizations in the US, function as community groups. And, if you're the only Hindu family in your area and there's a larger, HSS organization, in the next town over, you'll just go to their events because you want a Hindu community and you want this kind of feeling. And so a lot of these, what we would call Hindu nationalist organizations in the US, are really playing this kind of community building role, and especially for a racial minority, religious minority, like they do provide this kind of comfort that there is a larger community that I'm part of, and they're doing this kind of programming. And many of these organizations engage in community service and food drives and are kind of serving these communities. And of course, the really disturbing thing is that ideologically and in terms of their kind of political beliefs, many of these groups are connected with very far right extremist kind of thinkers in India and in the US. And um, they've been able to sort of go under the radar because they're positioning themselves as this, multicultural immigrant community organization, that there hasn't really been much scrutiny on like where is their funding going and what are their ties with these kind of right-wing groups. And I'll just give you an example, which I think illustrates kind of the stakes of what we're up against. The VHPA, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, or World Hindu Council of America, is one of the largest Hindu nationalist groups in the US. And they have like chapters all over the country, and they do like children's classes and summer camps and that kind of work. But they also have very strong ties to the VHP in India, which is a right-wing Hindu nationalist organization complicit in a lot of violence and inciting violence against minorities. And so a few weeks ago was this festival of Chaitra Navratri, which is a springtime festival dedicated to the goddess. It's 9 nights of worship. And one very common practice among some Hindus in North India is to read the Ramayana over those 9 days, which is a Hindu epic. And so the VHPA organized this Zoom version of the festival where there would be religious discourses on the Ramayana every 9 days of this festival. And until now, it's like, okay, all of that is fine. It's a festival. They're bringing in a speaker to give discourses. But the speaker that they brought is a man named Yati Narasimhan Saraswati, who is this extremely like violent, hate-mongering, Islamophobic priest in India who is very connected to Hindu nationalist organizations in India. He's incited violence against Muslims. He played a key role in sort of inciting the Delhi violence against Muslim families in Delhi just last year. He's publicly gone on record saying, Islam should be eradicated, Muslims should be, eliminated, and he's even encouraged violence against sort of Hindu revered saints like Shirdi Sai Baba, who had ties to Islam and Muslim identity as well. And so he's this kind of very, really like hate spewing kind of figure. And this VHPA brought him as the featured, person who's giving religious discourses to people in the US. And so that is sort of like the situation right now. And so Hindus for Human Rights, we launched this kind of online petition and public awareness thing that, this kind of ties and connections cannot be tolerated anymore, because this is just a very clear example of a Hindu organization in the US, which is calling itself a community group, giving a platform to a very violent Islamophobic, leader in India. And it's been really hard for people to mobilize against this and raise your voice against this, because if you're going after the VHP or HSS or these other Hindutva groups, these are also often the only Hindu groups in a community or in an area. And so our work is also to build up these alternative spaces and alternative organizations that, you know, allow you to practice your faith and are still religious cultural spaces, but are not in this like deep network of right-wing extremism. And so that's sort of to your question of like, what does it look like to stand up to these kind of forces? It's like this kind of work where we're having to confront other Hindu organizations and people in our community and say this, you know, this is where we have to draw a line, and this stuff is unacceptable. And yeah, I'll stop there. But there's just so much more to say.
I mean, what's interesting about for Christians and often for Jewish our Jewish friends, if they don't like the politics of the particular temple or a church that they go to, they can go to a different one, right?
Right.
Sometimes in the same city. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I guess I just that thought had not even crossed my mind that you might have to take your worship online in a different or in a way that's kind of antisocial with respect to people that you've gone to cultural events with for your whole youth, right? It just seems really really tricky. um,
It's really rough. It's like because of this lack of institutional kind of alternatives and explicitly progressive kind of Hindu spaces, it's really like Sadhana and Hindus for Human Rights are kind of the only two Hindu groups in the US right now which are trying to build up these platforms. And there are, that's not to say that there are not progressive temples and progressive priests. We are connected to quite a few very progressive Hindu temples in New York City and in other parts of the country, and many individual progressive priests who feel similarly that this type of work is important. But a lot of these priests are not institutionally supported, or they feel or they face rejection from their temple communities if they've associated with sadhana or groups like that. And it's not easy, but we're getting to that point where we can build more robust alternatives, I hope.
so to return to oh, to return to our earlier conversation about human rights violations in India right now,
Yeah.
what would you say is your primary diagnosis of the situation and what the solution is? Is it through electoral means mostly? Is it relying on international watch group organizations to come in and fix democracy if the system isn't working the way it's supposed to be working? Is it winning hearts and minds to vote Congress, or at least not BJP, or for the more right part of BJP?
Yeah, I'd say so. To start off, we are a nonpartisan organization, so we can't, go as far as endorsing a party or candidates. But I think our diagnosis of the situation really doesn't even have to be from our own words. Like, just look at the latest Freedom House report, which downgraded India from free to partly free this past year, or the US State Department's human rights report on India, which was released a couple of weeks ago, or the US International Commission on Religious Freedom, which released its annual report last week, with all with this scathing critiques of how democracy and human rights in India has just been on this free fall in the last several years. And you don't even have to look at US kind of critiques of India, because it's a fair question, like what right does the US have to critique another nation's human rights? But even in India, Amnesty International has been shut down by the government. So many human rights activists are imprisoned just for writing a tweet or for making a speech. I'd say the real issue that we're up against is just this shrinking democracy in India, and this is purely due to this authoritarian BJP government, which is won, many electoral gains. Modi has been elected in landslide, wins, and the BJP controls several states, and so they have had this kind of free reign to implement their vision. And part of their vision includes less freedom of speech, more restrictions on the media, more censorship, and of course, encouraging this rampant Islamophobia and casteism and violence against minorities. And so we're in a really, I'm sitting in DC, I'm not in India, but India is a really difficult place, is what we've been hearing from all of our counterparts on the ground. And it's just, the situation is such that speaking out against the government and expressing any form of dissent is increasingly more dangerous for just ordinary people. A few cases that kind of illustrate this is like back in February, we held this event drawing attention to the case of this young Muslim comedian named Munawar Faruqi, who is a young guy. He's very outspoken about the government. He was going to perform this comedy show one night in the city, and this right-wing Hindu group threatened, like they basically got him arrested on the suspicion that he was going to make fun of Hindu deities during his set. He hadn't even started performing and they had arrested him and his friends, and he was denied bail multiple times. And it wasn't until the Supreme Court of India intervened in his case that he was released. And many other people have been arrested for these kinds of very, like, they don't even have to commit this kind of act for them to go into jail. There's, of course, the case of these human rights activists who have been arrested in what's known as the Bhima Koregaon case, which is I think 16 very experienced human rights activists have all been put in jail on the basis of tampered evidence that U.S. companies, digital forensic companies, have examined, and they've put out multiple reports saying that this evidence used to incarcerate them was planted, and it was, this hacker was getting into their laptops. One of the people who's been arrested is this 83-year-old Jesuit priest, Father Stan Swami, who is the oldest person in India to ever be accused of terrorism. He's put in jail. He has Parkinson's disease and has been denied even like a sippy cup to be able to drink water because he can't hold a cup and a straw. And it's just this really brutal kind of crackdown on anyone who's trying to fight for human rights in India right now. And so we are an organization that's mostly in Indian American diaspora. Most of us are in the US, and this is sort of what we see as our responsibility as members of the Indian diaspora, to at least raise the volume here and to get our elected representatives to be paying attention. And it's it's difficult, and we face backlash in our work and from these right-wing Hindutva groups, but I'm not going to get police knocking on my door one night and be taken to jail and held without any evidence. But someone who says the same things that I do, who's in India right now, does have that legitimate fear. And that is, that's really what we're up against right now. And it's difficult because, I don't want to get into the geopolitics of all of this, but the US really, especially the Biden administration, they really see India as this democratic partner, and they're trying to counter China, which has its own set of kind of issues. And the more that India is going into this kind of turmoil and shrinking democracy, it just feels more and more hollow to keep repeating this thing of we have shared values and we're both democracies, and we both have our problems, but India is really in this shrinking space for dissent and human rights right now.
So it's very disheartening to hear again, but thank you for sharing that with us. It's April 30th today, and I just wanted to acknowledge that the second wave of COVID is sweeping through India right now. A lot of our friends and relatives are suffering or have even died, and it's really scary, the enormity of it. Um, what is Hindus for Human Rights strategy now? What do you do when both right wing Hindus and left wing Hindus and center Hindus and everybody else in India everyone's getting sick together and living through this horrific moment?
It is really scary. Just even in our organization, among our volunteers and advisory board members, we know people who currently right now have COVID, and people whose family members are in the hospital or just passed away. And you talk to nearly anyone who has a connection to India, and I think right now they must know someone who's passed away in the last few weeks. And it is really disheartening, but this is what we're trying to step up and provide as much support to our grassroots partners who are on the ground. Something that we've been seeing in just the last few weeks with this rising COVID cases and death tolls in India is that certain groups that are connected, like I mentioned, to this Hindu nationalist network, have been able to really fundraise a lot of money for disaster relief, and a lot of well-meaning Americans and people in the diaspora have donated to these organizations without knowing that they're actually tied to kind of right-wing Hindu supremacist organizations. And so something that we've been trying to do is really uplift the inclusive grassroots organizations that we know on the ground who are working directly with the most vulnerable and marginalized groups in India. One of the groups we support is called Rights. They're based in Kerala in South India, and they work with Dalit and Adivasi or indigenous families. And we have a whole list on our website of organizations who work with Muslim communities and Dalit communities and Adivasis and migrant laborers and really the most vulnerable and impacted groups in India right now. And we've been trying to promote their efforts far and wide and get diaspora support for these kind of grassroots groups rather than the much larger, well-funded kind of right-wing organizations who use a lot of this money for purposes that we would not see as helpful, but rather as harmful. So it's really trying to get those grassroots organizations as much emergency funding and support as we can to make sure they're able to do the work that they can do on the ground. But the other part of our advocacy has been to the US government, because we're seeing that unfortunately the Biden administration is not lifting these patent protections on vaccines. And just earlier this week, we wrote in a letter of support for the Seattle City Council's resolution urging the Biden administration to lift patent waivers so vaccines can be produced and distributed much more in India and other global South countries. We have been advocating for the administration to send more aid and medical supplies, and some of which is happening now. The Biden administration has announced that they are sending teams and equipment, but it's really this IP productions which are going to be really important if we want vaccines to be distributed at any level of scale in India. And that's the other level of our advocacy, which is focusing on that vaccine inequity as well as the grassroots support.
All throughout our experience of the pandemic here in the US, we've been hearing that the COVID problem is also an inequality problem, is also a racism problem.
Yes.
It also hits on all these different scales differentially. And it
Yeah.
shouldn't have surprised me that similar things are going on in India, and that India US, there's also an inequality gradient that we need to think about and
Yeah.
work against. And I'm glad Hindus for Human Rights is propping those organizations up and drawing attention to changes that we can make in the global infrastructure as
Yeah.
well. So thanks, thanks for sharing your perspective on that. Well, we've been going for about 45 minutes now. I want to end on a more positive note. I asked you in my email earlier when I listed some questions I was thinking of asking you for our chat. If you wanted to share with us a piece of religious visual art that has inspired you recently, or you can just talk about it if you want.
But something that has been really, I think, inspiring and really heartening to see kind of throughout the COVID pandemic, has been a little bit of this, like, there's always been kind of a sense of humor that Hindus and Indians have adopted to the way that gods and goddesses are depicted, and sort of this visual imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, something that I have just really enjoyed seeing since the beginning of COVID and throughout is the ways that, like, artists have been reinterpreting very traditional Hindu motifs and images to sort of send public health kind of messages, and to just sort of provide a more lighthearted take on the situation, which is really needed. And for example, one very common depiction of the goddess in many parts of India is in this form of Mahishasura Mardini, where the goddess Durga is slaying this demon Mahisha, who's in the form of a buffalo. And so she's like riding on this lion and has this like spear, and the demon is kind of being slain in this pose, and has all different many arms behind her that are holding different weapons and stuff. And I just am remembering this cartoon that was going around of the goddess depicted as kind of a nurse that's like slaying the COVID COVID virus, and she's wearing a mask and like holding all these medical equipment type of things. And it's like these kind of very lighthearted things, which I think do give people something to, it's something that pops up on your phone, and it's kind of, it does have this spiritual resonance to it. It's like gives you some hope and also some humor. And I think those kind of images and kind of playing with that traditional imagery is really quite, it's nice to see. And just recently with the COVID vaccine kind of discussions of the US sending vaccines and equipment to India, another cartoon that a colleague of mine has been working on is like a depiction of Hanuman, who's this Hindu deity in monkey form. There's a very popular depiction of him carrying this mountain, which is said to have these very powerful herbs that can help revive someone lost in battle. And Hanuman was sent to bring this special herb back to the battle and couldn't find it, so he just uprooted the mountain and brought that. And so this very common depiction of Hanuman just flying with this mountain. And so it's like, instead of Hanuman carrying a mountain of herbs, it's like Hanuman carrying a bunch of vaccines and stuff and bringing them back to India. And I think those are the sort of visual, religious, artistic kind of depictions which illustrate the kind of playfulness and humor that people are able to have even in a terrible pandemic situation like this.
I wanted to draw your attention. The Hanuman cartoon is up at Hindus for Human Rights website. It's on the main banner right now. So
Yes.
I just grabbed the GIF from the website so we can put it on our website too.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It was such a pleasure to learn about your journey and your advocacy work right now and the long road ahead. And looking forward to hearing good news in the future and as things hopefully get better, not worse.
Yeah.
But thanks
Yeah.
again.
No, thank you so much for having me and for giving this platform to share a little bit about our work. And I would love to send you the link to all of our grassroots partners in India if your viewers would like to support them. I think
We'll make sure to
all
post
the
it.
help that we can get.
Pleasure is all ours, and we have.